Thank you for joining us here today for this special workshop. In case you don't know me, I'm Adrian Ma. I'm an assistant professor here, and I've been helping out in the role of undergraduate program director for this academic year. Before we begin, I'd like to start with the land acknowledgements, but also a bit of a reflection on the context of our topic today about navigating misinformation and disinformation in times of conflict. Toronto is in the dish with one spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. We're consistently being encouraged to think about this acknowledgements in different contexts, not merely as something we do performatively. So when I think about this land acknowledgements, this important idea really sticks out to me, that we join here from different walks of life, different lived experiences to form a community. By this nature, this community will never exist without tension and opposing perspectives. But the hope is that there can be communication, collaboration, ways to coexist and ways to move forward. And it's been clear to me that as much as technologies like social media have brought us great benefits in these areas, it's also exacerbated the challenge of misinformation, disinformation, and amplifying confusion, particularly in times of great upheaval and conflict. Historically, Indigenous peoples have been targets of misinformation that have perpetuated stereotypes and contributed to systemic discrimination. This historical context underscores the damaging power of misinformation and reinforcing the need for journalists to diligently verify information and to correct false narratives. This is why I was very grateful to Craig Silverman when he offered to lead a school-wide workshop on navigating misinformation, disinformation, particularly in times of war. Craig is our Reader's Digest Foundation of Canada verification expert in residence, a national reporter for investigative news outlet ProPublica, formerly the media editor for BuzzFeed News, and an acclaimed author and expert on digital news manipulation and verification. So I believe Craig is going to present for about 45 minutes or so and then invite some questions from the audience. This talk will be recorded and shared as a video resource for student journalists and journalists alike later this week. Please join me in welcoming Craig. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So I appreciate the introduction, appreciate you folks coming. So obviously it's a very serious time and a very serious topic about it, and hopefully what you'll come away with is, some useful approaches and tools, but also just a way of sort of thinking about how you navigate what is a very complicated information environment, and also what is unique about conflict information environments as well. Because there are some things that it shares with sort of general breaking news, but there are also some things that are kind of unique to conflicts as well. And so I want to start with just kind of like a quick little case study about something I think we've all, let me turn this on, there we go. It's something we've probably all been following, which is the blast adjacent to a hospital in Gaza, which has killed hundreds of people. And, this started with obviously some footage from on the ground of the explosion, of it happening, of nearby. And right away, a lot of media outlets, particularly the New York Times and others, have sort of credited the health ministry there, saying, look, hundreds of people have died, and they cited an Israeli airstrike, had been responsible for it. And so in the early moments, we sort of get an indication of who is responsible, what has happened, and that kind of thing. And one of the things that we'll talk about and see is that, the early moments of breaking news, but especially the early moments in conflict events, there's often conflicting information, there's often information that turns out to be wrong. And sometimes we end up still days, weeks, months, years later, not actually knowing 100% what happened. And that is one of the things that I want to talk a little bit about today, is sort of getting a little bit more comfortable with that element of unverified or living in the gray, because we can't always know everything. And so rushing to assume, rushing to credit, rushing to point fingers is one place where news organizations often fall into trouble. And in this case, you have sort of, an official health ministry giving you a report, and it's very common for journalists and newsrooms. We cite officials, right? This is something we do. But there are many, many examples, large and small, whether it's police, whether it's health ministries or others, where official information comes out, and it turns out to not be the whole story or to be incorrect. And this is something that we always have to keep in mind. Now, pretty soon after that started circulating, you get, supporters of Israel, you get the actual Israeli government on Twitter and other places pushing back on saying this, no, this is absolutely not the case. It was rockets fired from Gaza. And, So they're making their case, but this video that was shared from the official kind of government account, from an ambassador's account, turned out to actually not be relevant to the hospital blast at all. And so you have official, again, government sources putting out information that turns out to be misleading. And so obviously that would undercut their message of like, no, this wasn't ours. Now, this happened at night, which limits visibility. By the next morning in Gaza, we start to get photos. Very few journalists make their way there. It's obviously extremely dangerous in Gaza right now. More journalists have been killed in Gaza in the last few weeks than I think have died in the entire sort of Ukraine-Russia conflict. And in this case, we start to get people with on-the-ground evidence, people with knowledge of, analyzing craters from missiles versus rockets and this kind of thing, starting to say, hold on a second, it's starting to look like maybe this wasn't an airstrike based on a few things, but you still don't know for sure, right? And of course, that leads to more disagreement, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Everyone should be trying to gather everyone's evidence. Everyone should be trying to figure out what went on. So it becomes a very difficult thing to navigate. There's a lot of finger pointing. There's a lot of people saying this, people saying that. And if we set aside journalists for a moment, just the average person, to actually figure out what they should think and what they should believe about this, it's very confusing because you have media contradicting media. And this is probably where it sits today, which is that most of the analysis that I've seen that are based on evidence of trajectory of rockets, evidence based on looking at videos of the time when the explosion happened, evidence of journalists going to the scene and looking for fragments of missiles or rockets and these kinds of things, evidence of calculating things like the size of the crater and if that's consistent with munitions used by Israel. All of these evidentiary approaches, right now, most of it is pointing to a rocket that misfired or went astray. But it's not 100%. And we may never know 100% what actually caused it. And what's interesting is, the New York Times obviously took a lot of criticism for citing this initial thing, blaming it as an Israeli airstrike. This was the most recent story from the New York Times yesterday, where they're saying that even the death total, there hasn't really been evidence. Nobody's been able to independently confirm it. They're not saying no one died there. Obviously, people absolutely died. They were sheltering there. This is a clear civilian target, but they're not able to actually confirm the death toll. And on top of that, a senior Hamas official said the missile dissolved like salt in the water. It's vaporized. Nothing is left, which is raising a lot of questions for weapons experts because that typically doesn't happen to missiles. But again, we're still in this gray area of not knowing 100% of what happened. And this is really frustrating, really difficult. It's leading to lots of tension and disagreement, but this is actually the kind of thing we see in conflict zones all the time. And we have to sort of realize that waiting and seeing and letting the evidence accumulate is one of the best ways to actually figure out what's going on in a given area. And the use of the cartoon isn't to minimize this at all, but this is something that is going on all the time, going back through every conflict you can imagine. I mean, for example, in World War II, rumors and false claims and things were so persistent that there were public information campaigns launched by the US government to warn people against rumor mongering and sort of assuming things and spreading information you hear. The Boston Herald newspaper actually set up what they called a rumor clinic, where people could submit the things they had heard and seen, and they would try to check those out. Now, of course, at this point in time, a lot of times they treated the US government as the be-all and end-all final word on this, right? And so this is one of the challenges we have, is that official sources, again, can be wrong. And we can't rely completely 100% on that, which is why we engage in reporting and why we practice the discipline of verification. So here's what I'm going to talk about today, is a little bit about sort of the mindset of verification and fundamental approaches to it, particularly in the digital environment. We're going to talk about some of those dynamics of conflict, mis and disinformation. I'm going to focus a lot on sort of visual videos, images. That's what we see most spreading on social media, for example, and how we verify those, giving you some examples from this current conflict, but also from stuff with Ukraine, Russia, where a lot of really great verification work has been done, and just a few quick sort of best practices, things around, if you're debunking something, what do you do, and approaches around that. And then obviously happy to take some questions. There's a great book called The Elements of Journalism, which outlines really what reporting in journalism is for. And it's a short book. It's a great read. Maybe it's assigned in some classes here. But really, when they kind of boil it down to like, well, what is the fundamental of journalism? They say that basically the discipline of verification is what separates journalism from other forms of communication, such as propaganda, advertising, fiction, or entertainment. So this is supposed to be at the core of what we do as journalists and in journalism. But I often find that, you know, the hands-on experience and knowledge is sort of lacking. It's like, well, okay, we're supposed to check facts and we talk to people and we consult sources. And, you know, how do you actually do verification? And one of the things that I suggest as really a starting point is like the mental aspect of this, is like how you think about information, how you think about how you're approaching information and reporting. So we can talk about tools, we can talk about techniques, but your mindset and your approach and how you think about and how you hold this as a really core thing of what you're always doing is really the starting point. And one of the reasons why that's necessary is that, you know, the way we make decisions, the way we process information, the way we, you know, treat things that are told to us, they are based on a wide variety of factors. And not all of it is like evidence and reason based. We are human beings with life experience. We have our own views. We have our own, you know, things that we have experienced in life, things that we have read, things that we believe. And all of those things as humans make us who we are. And they also factor into the kinds of information that we accept and the information that we reject. And so, number one, just being aware of that helps us kind of control for our own views and biases. It doesn't mean we should ignore everything we think and feel, but it means we have to be aware of it. So there's a certain amount of self-awareness of that. And that's what comes into this point from what actually it's a book aimed at intelligence analysts. But they talk about, it's not just about, you know, your reasoning process of your conclusions and your judgments and how do you get to those, but you actually have to sort of be self-conscious of like, why have I arrived at this place? So a healthy self-consciousness about why you have decided to accept this, reject that, about why you have ended up in this place and decided that this is, you know, what you plan to report is really important and really helpful. The mental aspect is hugely important because you can have all the information and reporting in front of you, but at the end of the day, you're deciding how to present it, how to sort of stack those facts. And these are active decisions we make. And sometimes we treat them like it's autopilot, like, oh, I'm a journalist, so obviously I'm going to be, you know, rational and reasonable about this. That's not the way it works. You know, we're human beings. And this is one of the core things to also keep in mind, which is that we don't treat information in a purely rational way just because we're journalists, right? We have an emotional relationship with information. Depending on what that information is, it may be very emotional, or it may be something we actually don't have a lot of passion or knowledge or beliefs or priors on. And again, being self-conscious of that and recognizing as we're looking at information how we feel about it and how we act and how we process things is a really, really important element. So you're going to hear me use the term misinformation and disinformation. You've probably heard it a lot. If you haven't sort of encountered definitions of it, these are typically the ones that I kind of go with. So misinformation is false or misleading information that's, you know, being disseminated or shared, but unintentionally. So well-meaning people sharing something, maybe because it aligns with their beliefs, maybe because it, you know, accords with what they think probably happened, right? And it turns out to be false or misleading, and they didn't know that it was unintentional. Whereas disinformation is like the conscious creation and spreading of false or misleading information. And motivations around these, you know, can vary. You know, but you know, on the misinformation side, display of their identity is really important, particularly on social media. A lot of what we share and talk about on social media is a way of representing who we are and expressing our identity, right? Like we share something and it's not just because it was funny, but maybe it's something we identify with as well, right? And with disinformation, there are lots of motivations, you know, money, political gain, people who just want to kind of throw a wrench into how things work and see the chaos. And intent is important if we can actually figure that out through our investigation and verification process, but oftentimes it's hard to do that. And today we're going to focus more on sort of like how do we figure out whether this thing is what it claims to be rather than necessarily who's behind it. And this is a resource from an organization called First Draft, where they kind of divided up the common types of mis and disinformation you might see. The most common type, and the thing that we're going to talk about a lot today, is the one in the middle there, false context. So when genuine content is shared with false contextual information. So it is a real video of a real thing that happened, but they say that it happened yesterday in Gaza when actually it happened 3 years ago in Lebanon, for example, right? And so this is the most common type of mis or disinformation we see. It's often well-meaning people sharing it, thinking it's real, or it's sometimes people consciously taking an old video or an old photo and sharing that with false context around it. And obviously it ranges all the way to fabricated content, things that are 100% false, made to deceive, made to do harm. Manipulated content, we'll talk a little bit as well with AI, large language models, and synthetic media production. It's very easy to generate things that are artificial. And the verification process for that is certainly connected to the fundamentals that we're going to go through today. And just to recap in terms of false and misleading information, the stuff that works best is based on real events and details. So that's why breaking news and conflict zones are such fertile environments for false and misleading information, because there's so much passion, it's fast moving, there's chaos, there's high stakes, it's life and death. It's building on that, it's targeting emotion, one supporting side or another perhaps, and appealing to that belief or bias. It sort of supercharges people's intent to actually want to share. And because we have these networks, these social networks, it is very easy to get stuff to move very quickly. And so it can go viral. Again, it's the most visual stuff that is, we're seeing the most of, but it's also really easy to share. It's really powerful to see it as an image, as a video, and that's the stuff that tends to be most successful. When we talk about verification, a lot of this may seem familiar in terms of the things you hear and learn about reporting, the who, when, where, why, and that kind of thing. In the context of digital content, this takes on a little bit of a different element in the sense of the first thing is knowing that it is easy to grab and share and remix content. Have we actually found the original? Have we found the person who took the photo, who shot the video? Have we found the first place it was shared? That is one of the only ways to actually feel confident about what you are looking at and what you are verifying. And so that is the first thing that we need to confirm. And then once we have figured out, like, okay, where did this come from? We can figure out, who captured it, when, and where. And again, because false context is so common, if we can figure out location and if we can figure out date, then we'll know whether this is a video from Gaza or it's from Lebanon. And so this is kind of the checklist that every news organization that has, dedicated visual investigations team or other sort of often called OSINT specialists, meaning open source intelligence specialists, this is basically what they all go through. And the last one is motivation. And this is important for kind of those mental reasons that I already talked about. If somebody is, at a protest filming something, and they are, decidedly themselves on a particular side, and they're standing on one side, filming the other side of protesters, the things that they capture are going to be dictated by where they're standing and the virtue of them supporting one side. They may choose to highlight the most angry people on the other side to make them look as bad as possible, right? And they may not be doing this consciously. They may just be thinking about that's what I want to be filming. They may be, cropping and zooming in on things that are interest to them and leaving out other contexts. And so if we can understand some of the fundamentals of the motivation of like why somebody was there, why they were filming, that can help us get important contextual information. It doesn't mean we dismiss them and their ideas or their beliefs, but it absolutely means that we have a bit more information to understand why they were filming, why they were focused on that, what else they might have left out. So that's kind of our initial thing, is the thinking part of it, the mindset part of it, self-awareness, understanding that as humans, we process information in an often emotional way, and then thinking about how we can confirm original source of content, the when, the where, the why. Really important things. We'll look at some examples in a second. But when it comes to sort of the dynamics of conflict, mis and disinformation, here are a few key things to keep in mind. One is just like the speed and the chaos of the nature of this information. Things are moving really, really fast. And so this allows people who may want to consciously spread false information or put things in an inaccurate context to get stuff out there quickly. And the sense of urgency that people feel around life and death scenarios like conflict makes them more susceptible to sort of taking things in and sharing it right away, because they feel like this is really important. This airstrike just happened. I need to share the information or know everything about it. So the information environment is part of the battlefield. It is part of the battlefield for people not intending to be part of it, and it is absolutely part of the battlefield for the state actors, for the people involved in the conflict. They are trying to control and influence and manipulate the information environment. That is absolutely part of any military and government strategy, and this is something that we need to be aware of. And in that sort of strategy of controlling and influencing the information environment, they absolutely are taking into account what journalists are producing. And that's why you see governments trying to come out very quickly with claims about things and to attribute things to the other side. And we as journalists have to be aware of that and really stay focused on the evidence and the information that we can gather. So we see dynamics like official sources can and will be wrong. Sometimes it's intentional, sometimes it's not. Sometimes, you know, whatever information came into that ministry and they decide to put it out before they've sort of maybe done their own checks. But this is something that we have to understand, and so taking the word of officials just on face value is something that carries a lot of risk to it, particularly in conflict information environments. And you know, the people who are out there trying to influence this environment, it's not just governments, it's not just state, it's not just military. You have a whole range of people. Some people, you know, today on Twitter, you can actually earn money by getting really viral content that a lot of other people view and interact with. You can literally get a check at the end of the quarter or the month if you got a lot of other verified accounts to interact with it. And so suddenly there is a business model for creating highly engaging content on Twitter for users, and that has seen a huge amount of people posting stuff that is incorrect, that is really gruesome, violent imagery because it gets a lot of engagement. And so you have financially driven actors, you have professional actors, there are, you know, marketing agencies and PR firms that will 100% do disinformation for hire services now. And so they're often involved in the environment. And then, of course, you have people who are ideologically driven and want to sort of represent their side in the information environment. And so we have lots of actors with different motivations, creating what is often a lot of confusion and chaos. And this is also mixing with state actors and official actors who are also trying to get their message out. And we have to sit here and be able to sift through all of this. We're going to talk about an AI-generated example in a little bit, but one of the things to keep in mind is, like, you have to be aware of potentially AI-generated content. But you also have to be aware of false accusations of real things being, you know, wrongly labeled as AI, because that's a kind of new form of warfare, which I'll show you an example of in a second. And so the things that we want to think about are patience, are restraint, and focusing on the evidence and the sourcing, and getting information that is as close to the ground as possible, as much as possible. So some examples of things we've seen in recent years. You know, the Russia annexed territory in Ukraine many years ago before the full-scale invasion, and there was an onslaught of disinformation that came about that from Russia. And one example was kind of, you know, early in that conflict, there was a Malaysian Airlines jetliner that was shot down over Ukraine. You know, and initially Russia blamed Ukraine, said a Ukrainian, you know, missile or plane had shot it down, and Ukraine blamed Russia. And, you know, hundreds of people lost their lives in this. It was a huge tragedy. And for years, there has, you know, been trying to be efforts to figure out who and what actually shot this down. And in the meantime, you know, we got a lot of false information. So like this example from Elliot Higgins, who runs the organization Bellingcat, you know, at one point, the Russian military actually held a press briefing and showed a video saying, look, here is the Malaysian Airlines flight. You can see that it's being shot down by Ukraine and all this kind of stuff. But it turned out that the plane that they were citing and using wasn't the actual plane, and you could tell by the logo was placed in the wrong spot on it. And they came up with a lot of different explanations of what actually happened to MH17, and it changed over the years, and you can sort of see that timeline there. But the way we actually got to kind of figuring out what had really happened took many years. So that's the first thing. That element of patience is really important. So what were the things that contributed to actually understanding? Well, the suspicion was that it was actually a mobile missile launcher called a Buk missile launcher that Russia had been supplying to some of the sort of separatist groups in Ukraine. And through scouring CCTV footage, scouring social media, a lot of researchers were able to start getting footage of a mobile Buk missile launcher passing through Russia into Ukraine and into the sort of separatist regions. And so they were able, over the course of months and years, to actually retrace the entire path of this one missile launcher all the way through and getting its path to the actual missile launch site. And then in terms of, you know, the day and the location of where this missile was fired from, through searching, you know, Russian language posts and Ukrainian language posts on social media, people were able to find things like this tweet where somebody actually sees the clouds and in the sky that came from the missile that had been launched to shoot it. So because everybody's got a phone, everybody's documenting things that they see, if you know how to search and find things, you can start to potentially piece together the narrative. And over time, they were actually able to even locate the exact place where the Buk missile launcher seemed to have been parked, because you could see the sort of burned out area in a field where they parked it and then fired the missile, which would, of course, caused a whole bunch of fire. And this is like, I'm oversimplifying here. This is an amazing amount of work to verify each and every single one of these things. But this is what happens over years when you're actually trying to go after this stuff and you have a lot of different people. And then one of the other amazing things is they have the same missile launcher with the same serial number and everything on it. They could find it going back through Ukraine into Russia after the plane had been downed and the missile had been fired. So not only did they track it going there and finding that location, they were able to track it going back into Russia. And eventually there were also intercepts of people who ran and operated this missile launcher that were released. And so you basically had the entire picture of like which missile launcher. Oh, and by the way, one of my favorite details on this of its path back into Russia, the missile launcher has 4 missiles in it. And when this exact same missile launcher with all the same markings and everything was making its way back into Russia, it had 3 missiles instead of 4 on the back of it. So they could see that like one had been fired by this mobile missile launcher. So this is the kind of work and the kind of disinformation that you'll see. You know, something big happens, the two sides are both blaming each other. How do you figure out what actually happens? It can take a lot of work. This is an example from last year that we came across at ProPublica with some researchers, where we saw like Russian government accounts as well as other kind of pro-Russian accounts sharing these videos that they actually claimed were fact checks. And so they were saying like, look, don't trust this Ukrainian video claiming, you know, it destroyed Russian military equipment. This is actually a video from 2014, which again is a common thing we see, an old video used as new. But what was strange about these supposed fact checks was that we couldn't find any example of the original supposed fake circulating anywhere. And when we reached out to people who had shared these videos and to Russian authorities saying, can you point us to the original thing you are debunking, they couldn't point us to anything. And we ended up doing some other analysis of these videos themselves. You know, but at the end of the day, what these were fake fact-checking videos. And the reason that you would create fact-checking videos is to inject a sense of doubt among Russian language audiences as they encounter real images of wrecked Russian military vehicles and the destruction in Ukraine. And so the idea here is to them to sort of tell the Russian audiences, listen, don't trust all this stuff you're seeing about, you know, destroyed Russian vehicles. It's all Ukraine making false claims and trying to make us look bad. And so it was using fact-checking, misusing fact-checking to sort of spread disinformation. These are the levels that people are kind of going to now, because they understand that fact-checking is, you know, widespread. And if you can sort of take that and use it to spread false claims that work in your favor, that's actually very effective. Another thing that we saw also last year was this is footage from a climate, I believe it was a climate protest. And this is, you know, a news reporter talking about it. And as part of the protest, people got in boggy bags and laid down as sort of saying, you know, this is going to kill us and kill the planet. And at one point in the news report, someone who's in one of these body bags like gets up at the protest. And so this was shared by a bunch of Russian language accounts saying, look, here's a bunch of, you know, Ukrainian fake dead bodies. They're trying to convince you people are dying there. It's not what they say. And there was a whole network of accounts, as well as on TikTok, that were sharing these. And, you know, they reshared the same video with the same false claim, and they all sort of made their own comments, you know, and my favorite line there is, information war is reaching a new level, said the account spreading completely false claims about a misused video, right? In terms of what we've seen just recently in the Israel-Hamas conflict, you know, the Israeli government released audio footage claiming to actually be operatives, Hamas operatives, talking about how, oh no, you know, we accidentally bombed the hospital. And there's been a lot of concerns and skepticism expressed about the accuracy of this. What's interesting to me about it is that, you know, with that example of the missile launcher, one of the pieces of evidence that came out was actual intercepts of actual Russian military people talking about, oh shit, we just shot down an airplane. And it seems to me that the Israeli government, you know, released this because that was very compelling evidence and it was able to be verified through a variety of means, whereas this, no one has been able to verify that this is actually two Hamas operatives talking to each other. And so I think people justifiably remain extremely skeptical of that. What else have we seen? This was a Twitter account claimed to be an Al Jazeera journalist. You know, so, you know, in this case, they were saying it was a Hamas misfired rocket, accusing Al Jazeera of lying, claiming they were journalists and undermining the news organization, so positioning themselves as like a whistleblower. But this account was absolutely not an Al Jazeera journalist. For a long time, they were posting mostly exclusively about Indian politics and supporting the Modi government. So it seemed to clearly be somebody in India or very interested in India. And so there were a lot of these kinds of tweets with knowledge about Indian politics. And also, of course, Al Jazeera itself came out and said, this is not one of our reporters, this is a completely fake account. And so, again, generating fake fact checks, using fake reporter accounts, using the media itself as a way to kind of spread disinformation or seed doubt is a very powerful tactic. There's also been, examples of kind of fake Israeli Facebook pages in this case where they're, falsely claiming credit for the hospital strike. This is not a real Israeli government Facebook page. And this is what I talked about here of sort of some of the risks around synthetic media and AI. So this is a case where Ben Shapiro, big right-wing commentator, shared an image which I've blacked out of a burned. I believe it's now been confirmed that this is a baby and a parent sort of burned together. And so he shares this to saying, see, you're doubting this. Here, look at it. And of course, on Twitter, people can be part of their kind of community notes feature where you can actually add labels and fact checks to information. And somebody appended one on this saying, hey, this is an AI-generated photo. We tested it because there's a site called aiornot.com where you can upload an image and it will tell you whether it's generated by AI or not. And so this very big popular Twitter account was basically, fact-checked by this platform element here. But, what ended up happening is, another very questionable source here says, no, this is a lie because of the AI-generated element on there. But what ended up happening later on was that there was another community note added saying, like, actually aiornot.com is unreliable at detecting AI images. So you have this battle over using AI detection tools, which are like dubious of efficacy. So you use that, and then you add a community note saying, oh, this is not true. So you're able to use that as a way to question whether or not this was a real image. And then it just continues, and people are arguing back and forth, and other people use the community notes feature to say, no, actually, that detector is not true. Again, forget as a journalist, just as an average person trying to figure out what the heck is going on here is extremely difficult. These community notes are supposed to be helpful and supposed to be kind of reliable, but that original one on Ben Shapiro was not reliable, and then another one gets added later to explain why the original one was not reliable. It's very confusing, and this is very hard for people to navigate. So how do we do this? How do we engage in verification of these kinds of claims, this type of material? Again, let's remember our fundamentals here. We need to find the original piece of content, particularly when we're dealing with visual and image content. The who, the when, the where, and the why are also important to us. And this involves technical work. This involves sourcing. All of the tools and approaches we can possibly use as journalists, we want to sort of put to use here in this. What I talk a lot about in the class that I teach here is, sort of two levels of analysis that we want to do. One is observational. So, we're watching a video, we're looking at a photo, what can we see? What is there? There's a lot of information in visual content for us just on an observational level. If we're trying to figure out the location, are there buildings, are there street signs, are there license plates? If it's a video and there's audio, can we hear people talking? What language is it? Is there an accent? Are there very specific structures that we can identify to help locate where this is? So just on an observational basis, there's actually a lot we can do to try to figure out location and try to figure out the when and that kind of thing. And then on a technical level, there's a variety of different approaches people use. I'm going to focus today just on reverse image search, which is like the core fundamental first thing everyone needs to know and use. But there's lots of cases where, for example, people will reconstruct, a 3D model of something to figure out, the trajectory of bullets or rockets or missiles. There is analyzing the metadata, the data embedded in a digital file for a photo or a video. And so, there's a whole bunch of other things that you can do. But honestly, if you fine-tune your observational skills and you use things like reverse image search, you are going to be able to achieve a lot without needing to have a lot of technical expertise or knowledge. So that's what I want to sort of focus on here. And so, you know, there's those elements, but of course, we care about finding the person who created this or shot this. Can we interview them? Can we talk to them? Can they give us additional footage? Did they take other photos? Did they shoot other video? Can we get on the ground? Can we interview people who witnessed something, who were there? Can we, you know, gather fragments from either a rocket or a missile or what have you there and be able to send that off for analysis? And of course, you know, as much as I've talked about how we have to have a healthy skepticism of official sources, we should be developing sources inside governments, inside NGOs, inside human rights organizations who may be on the ground, who may have other information to add. And we factor that in with the other stuff we're gathering. And of course, whenever possible, can we get, you know, other types of recordings? Can we get records through records requests, through sources inside places? All of these things together is how we do good journalism and how we properly verify things. If you can get as much of this stuff with your observational and technical analysis, and if it is pointing in one direction, that's where you can start to feel a little bit more confident about your findings. All right, so here's one example of footage that circulated. So in this case, they're claiming that several high-profile Israeli generals have been captured by Hamas fighters. So we see this video. We've got guys being pulled out of an SUV. We've got some, you know, military folks there. There's not a lot for us in terms of buildings, right? Not a lot in terms of landmarks. You know, we don't get to see a license plate, unfortunately. But there's still a fair amount of information there for us, right? So if we were to look just observationally, what do we see? Well, you know, the guys in the military stuff, they've got, you know, this DTX logo on it. They've got a patch on the side there. We've got a flag, which doesn't, to me, look like, you know, an Israeli flag or a Palestinian flag or a Hamas flag. And then also in that first one there, we've got a watermark with the name of something. Maybe it's the account where this video originated, right? And so even though, you know, we can't see much about videos, we can't see much about, you know, the location, or sorry, much about the building or the location or, you know, the license plates, there's still a good amount of information where we can sort of start from this just by looking at the video and seeing it. So, like, what's the most simple thing we could do? Well, one, we can just search that text that was watermarked on it, right? And if we do that, we find things like, oh, there's a TikTok account in that name. There's also a YouTube account in that name. And when you look at it, you can see that, you know, this seems to relate to Azerbaijan, right? This is not in Arabic. We can run it through Google Translate. We can see, okay, they're talking about the, you know, Azerbaijan Republic. They're talking about Azeri police. Okay, so we're starting to see here, well, maybe this is, you know, this originated in Azerbaijan. And, you know, when we searched through that, I actually saw, like, one of the things that came up was a result from TikTok here in Google of a video with guys in a similar uniform with DTX on their fatigues, right? This whole thing takes just a few minutes, right? We notice what's in the video, we start searching on it, we can actually find footage here, and that takes us to the TikTok. We can see here, like, oh, it's like basically a promotional video for the Ministry of Internal Affairs, State Security Service. It's all these guys with the flag, with the DTX on their uniforms and other elements. And so at this point, we can start to feel, you know, fairly confident, like there's nothing in this video that is really suggesting this has to do with Israel or Hamas. And eventually, you can find the DTX official channel on YouTube with this exact video of them arresting these guys. And so, you know, this is a short case study to show that observational stuff is really powerful. And if you look closely at what is there for you, you can often, in the matter of a few minutes, actually start to have a sense of what this is, or actually find the original video itself. And in this case, you know, again, step number one is find the original source of content. And we can see here, this is a video. It was, you know, it was old. It was older than, you know, this current conflict, and, you know, coming from an official Azeri government channel. And so we can start to feel pretty confident about, we found the original. We have a sense of when this, you know, when this was. We could also, for example, take, you know, screenshots of the guys' faces and see if we could match them to the people. But of course, the video itself gives us some detail about, you know, who these guys were that were being arrested. And so within a matter of minutes, we can actually get a relatively high level of confidence about what that video was. So here's another one. So here's an account. Israeli Air Force is bombing targets in Gaza, right? And so we see a bombing, we see an explosion. And so how would we sort of figure out, you know, where this was? You know, at this point, really, what we're seeing is a lot of buildings, right? So we'd want to try and figure out okay, is this in Gaza? But not only that, is it recently in Gaza? Is it, months ago? Because obviously Israel has been bombing and doing airstrikes in Gaza for a long time, right? And so in this case, I talked about reverse image search being really important. So if you're not familiar with reverse image search, you can go to Google, you can enter words, and it will find you web pages that have those words, right? That Google has indexed and say, we think what you're looking for is this, and here's a bunch of web pages that reflect those words. You can do a search as well, starting with an image, or in the case of video, a screenshot of a video. And so it's very easy with a still image to run a reverse image search, but with a video, basically what journalists do is take screenshots of the video at different points in the video and run those through reverse image search. And so that's what I did in this case. I took some screenshots of that video on Twitter. I ran it into a reverse engine called TinEye. So the best ones to use are Google, TinEye, and Yandex. You want to run across multiple image search tools as much as possible to get different results. And in this case, the screenshot I had taken of the video did actually get a few results. One from like Google News, some from Sky, which is a news organization in the UK. And what was interesting to me is that, these results, if you see there, I did highlight it. It says May 13th, 2023 is when it saw these results. So that would obviously predate this most recent flare-up in the conflict, right? And so it's like, okay, so it looks like this may be an old footage of explosion, but that's not enough. We need to compare, we need to work more to actually figure out, okay, yes, is this Gaza, was this from May? So one of the things we could do is we could start to search, were there Israeli airstrikes in Gaza in May? Which we would find, yes, there were. And then we'd also want to try and figure out, is this actually the same video? So one of the nice things that TinEye does is it allows us to look at, the image of my screenshot on the right with the image of the video that they have found as a match on the left. And so, just as a simple starting process, if we look at it and we compare the buildings in my screenshot of the video we're trying to verify on the right with that highlighted section there on the left, we can see that, yeah, these do appear to be the same videos. And if we, run these videos, they do appear to be in the same location. If we run them side by side, the difference is that the one I had was cropped just to that section, whereas this video back from May actually showed much bigger part of the area. And so from there, we start to get a little more confident, like, yes, this is this. And if we see that there were news reports with that footage from back in May, we can be very confident that this is not new footage of airstrikes in Gaza. It's actually footage that goes back to May. So right place, wrong time frame. And this is something we see a lot. Another example here is this actually aired on the Ali Velshi show on MSNBC recently. And this guy talking here is named Eric Carvin. He's the head of social news gathering for NBC News, which are people who are constantly trying to find footage and images online and verify it. That's a team dedicated to doing this. And so he talks about how in the immediate aftermath of the hospital strike, that he had seen this footage and he was trying to figure out if this footage actually was from the hospital or not. And you can see there's not a lot to go on in there, right? You can see that, there's fire. It seems like it's like a laneway or a hallway. And, he was trying to figure it out. And at a certain point, he said he just sort of set it aside because, there wasn't a huge amount of visual information for him there observationally. And what he decided to do was he decided to just go and find as many videos shot in this hospital pre this conflict as possible to familiarize himself with the design, the layout, and the look of the hospital itself. And what he ended up coming across was a video filmed by an aid organization that helps fund the hospital. And in this video, he saw these people walking kind of down this corridor, and he paused and he's like, wait a second, this corridor looks kind of familiar to me. And so he started looking at it and he's like, wait a second, could this be the same thing? And so he engaged, and this may seem really rudimentary, but this is what a lot of visual verification people do. We had a great guest speaker in my class a few weeks ago who works she's at UC Berkeley, has done a lot of work with different news organizations around verifying footage. And she talked about how she will put the two photos in her case, a keynote slide, and we'll actually just start drawing boxes around the kind of key elements to see if they line up. And that's what Eric Carvin from NBC did, is he's like, okay, I've got my video in broad daylight here on the right. I've got what appears to be footage from the hospital on the left. Do we find things matching up there? And he's got sort of like this little globe there in green, which is not shown very well, but he could see the outline of it very vaguely. We see the two walls. And so he starts to get to a point where he can feel more and more confident that this might be footage. Now, based on this alone, they wouldn't use that footage on NBC. They wanted to do more, such as figuring out like who filmed this, where did it come from, can we confirm that it's new and it's recent and that kind of thing. But this is where he starts getting a sense of the place here and feeling a little more confident about the actual place. Wall Street Journal, if you haven't seen, put out a video recently talking again about the hospital explosion. And what they managed to do was they found 4 different camera angles, all showing the same sort of volley of rockets at the exact time. And so they gathered all those by searching online to find footage. They verified that it was recent footage, that it was of that night, and that kind of thing. And then they started, looking at the positions of the cameras and figuring out where they were, because these 4 cameras ended up filming the rocket barrage from different angles. And so they could see sort of like, well, what happened here and what happened there. So getting multiple elements of footage, being able to view all of them, see if they all line up together, this is one of the core things that people do. And then, of course, because like Reuters and AP and a lot of news organizations in the region were finally able to get to the hospital parking lot, in the days following, you got a lot of photos of like what appears to be the crater of where whatever munition it was hit. And so then they're calculating like where the rockets were coming from. And again, like Wall Street Journal is saying that all the evidence is pointing towards a rocket, but nobody is saying 100%. They're all saying all the evidence is pointing towards this. They are not saying 100% we know exactly what it was, but the evidence is starting to tilt in that direction. And so that's like a quick sort of run through of the kinds of work that you see people doing and the ways that we approach it from the observational side and from the technical side. And if anyone's interested in kind of doing more in this area, this is a great tool set called InVid, which is actually built by journalists for journalists. And it has really great tools for reverse image search, where you can also upload a video or just give them a Facebook or a YouTube link, and it will extract thumbnails for you and enable you to search across Google, Yandex, and TinEye with the push of a button. So it really speeds up the process of doing this reverse image searching, of analyzing footage. And they have a whole bunch of other tools in there around metadata and other things like that if you want to dive in deeper on some of the approaches for verification. But on a simple level, if you have an image you want to reverse image search, you have a video you want to reverse image search, InVid, this free browser plugin, is a really great tool to use to do that. Okay, last one I wanted to talk about before just a few final tips is synthetic media. So obviously you can generate images using AI now. They're getting better and better, and we're seeing more of them being shared and used, certainly in conflict environments. And in this case, well, I want to talk about this image in a second, but the first piece of advice I have for you on synthetic media verification is to stick to the fundamentals. So if you reverse image search it, can you find other copies of this video, of this image? Can you find that the people in it actually exist? Can you find that this corresponds to a real location? If something is synthetically generated, it's going to lack all of those other, surrounding materials that you get from real things. There won't be other footage of it. The people in it you may not be able to find them anywhere. So in some ways, the absence of results becomes a clue to you that, okay, I can't find any of this footage anywhere else. When I talked to the person who shared it, they wouldn't tell me where they took it. They wouldn't share with me the original from their phone. All of these kinds of clues from basic verification start to make you a little bit suspicious. And now AI-generated images and video are getting really good, but they still aren't perfect. And there are often things in them, if you look closely observationally, that may be a clue. When it comes to faces and bodies, they're really bad with like teeth. They're really bad at matching jewelry. They're bad with fingers. They often have like the wrong number on a hand. And it's often not like the person in the foreground. It's often the people they're putting in the background that it's sort of like the engine is sort of going a little bit lazy on. And so it's like if you look closely, it's like, oh yeah, that person back there has 2 heads or what have you, right? So observationally, that is a really important level of analysis. There are tools out there that will like do a sort of analysis and tell you whether this is likely to be AI or not. Some of them, are okay, but none of them are perfect because none of them can detect every type of AI-generated image or video. And so I don't recommend you ever rely on those solely. You can run something through it and see if you're getting a result that indicates it might be AI generated, but you can't run a story based on that. You have to do other types of analysis and confirmation. In the case of this photo, the claim here was that this was a camp set up for displaced Israelis. And obviously, if there had been a camp set up for displaced Israelis, there would probably be news reports and government announcements about that. And so just searching about it to see, like, is there a camp in existence is one way to start verifying this. But looking at it observationally, one of the things that stood out to me is, like, there's this weird double Star of David flag in the back. It just didn't seem to look right. Even if it's two flags, they don't seem to be obeying the laws of physics and wind and what have you. And so just looking closely at what's there, and also even over here, it's like all these people seem to be sort of milling around or lined up, but they seem to be lined up to get into like the smallest tent anywhere, and that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But these are like things you notice and things that might sort of raise your concern that, oh, maybe this is AI generated, but you have to obviously continue the process of, can I find other footage? Are there any reports validating that there's an Israeli, displaced persons camp? And as you get to figure those things out and see that there's no announcement of that, you reach out, to sources, human rights organizations, aid organizations, Israeli government, none of them have ever heard of anything like that. You can start to sort of be more confident that, yes, this is a photo of something that does not exist. Okay, so just to wrap up here, with a few best practices. One of the things that journalists are trying to do in conflict environments and in general is to identify false and misleading content and debunk it. And there are some best practices around that. There are also best practices for handling claims and rumors, that are circulating in conflict environments. And so one of the things that we have to really think about and get good at is the idea of communicating uncertainty. You absolutely, at times, will have to write articles, produce stories, produce reports about things that have an undetermined origin or element to it, right? And the more that we can do a good job of communicating uncertainty to the people consuming that content, the more ethical that is and the better informed they will be. Sometimes you really just want to tell people, it's kind of unclear what happened. It's very early. There's conflicting reports. We don't know what is actually the truth of this matter. That is sometimes the best service we could do to people, is to allow them to just sort of sit and be patient and say, wait, because that's often one of the best things you can do when it comes to conflict information. So this is an example of a report from a few days ago from NPR, where they talk about Hamas blames an Israeli airstrike for the blast, a charge the Israeli Defense Forces has vigorously denied, and it's sort of, you get the back and forth stuff. And so they get to a point where they're like, okay, there's a lot of dispute. We understand there's dispute. And then they get to the point and they say, here is what the available evidence shows so far. And so they're not making a conclusion. They're saying, here is the best of the evidence that we have seen, just so you're aware of that. There's competing claims, there's denials, there's accusations. You have quoting somebody saying, immediately it just became a very confusing situation. You have conflicting claims, all this footage. So they're making the reader understand, this is confusing. We don't know actually the end result yet. Here is what has been gathered so far, right? And so framing that for an audience is really important. On the left-hand side is an example from BBC. They say, BBC Verify is trying to unravel what is and isn't known. And then they detail what they've done. They say, looking at video footage, still imagery, and other evidence, including eyewitness accounts. In addition, a BBC journalist has been to the blast site where there is limited access. New information is emerging all the time, so we will continue to update this article as we learn more and talk to experts. So they're really explaining to their audience, like, here is what we've been gathering, here's what we've been doing. We had somebody on the ground, but you know what? It's still not 100% conclusive, and we're going to keep updating and letting you know. And then, CNN, the paragraph I highlighted, they talk about some of the limitations. They talk about, here's what we've done. We've reviewed dozens of videos. We've got stuff filmed by freelance journalists working for CNN. We got satellite imagery, but you know what? We haven't been able to access the site and gather evidence from the ground, so no conclusion can be definitive. And then they say, here's what it suggests, And so these are the attempts of news organizations to really help educate the audience of, like, here's what we've got. There's limitations to it. We're going to keep trying, and sometimes that's the best we can do. To go back, there's the New York Times example on this, but also an example from the U.S. back in 2021, in the last days when the U.S. was leaving Afghanistan, there was a drone missile strike that the U.S. claimed was an ISIS, I think it's ISIS-K was the organization called, member. And this ended up killing, I think it was like a dozen people. And the U.S. military said, yeah, they had a bomb, they were going to go, do it. We've thwarted a suicide attack. And even as people started to raise questions about it, the then, I think, chief of the Joint Chiefs of Staff or what have you, he called it a, quote, righteous strike. Well, it turns out they killed an aid worker and like 7 children and other people. And it was only after the New York Times and other people gathered footage, had a reporter on the ground interviewing people, that they actually got the U.S. military to admit that that is what happened. And so the risk is taking the official word right away. And this is something that we do in journalism, we attribute it. But I think when the stakes are very high, we have to think about how we do this. And I've got journalism as an act of pointing there in quotes because this is a quote from a guy named Josh Benton years ago in the New York Times where he talks about news organizations just grabbing viral stuff and pointing to it saying, hey, there's this claim, there's that claim. It's journalism as an act of pointing, not as an act of verification. And if we don't know and we're attributing, understand that just the act of attributing and putting that out there lends credibility to it. So we have to be judicious in thinking about that. And this goes back to kind of research I did in 2015, where we gathered a whole bunch of news articles that were about rumors, about unverified claims, and we saw how the news organizations talked about it. So they would use the word, report, or puts the claim in quotes, or they use the attribution says, or they add a question to the end of it to sort of say like, well, we don't know what's going on here. This is what they're saying, but we don't know, right? And this is something we do, but again, we have to think about the stakes here, where we're declaring something to be a rumor, we're saying it may have happened, we're saying sources say this, what level of uncertainty should we actually be communicating instead of that? So last 2 things, when we are debunking something, one of the things we want to think about is whether it's actually reached enough people or is likely to reach enough people that it warrants us going and declaring this to be false. And the risk here is that if there's a claim that, is totally false and potentially harmful, but actually very few people have seen, by us sort of saying, hey, there's this claim and it's false, we risk actually exposing more people to the false claim itself. And so is this concept of sort of the tipping point, how much engagement is it getting? Is it moving across platforms? Have influential people shared it or talked about it? And making that news call of whether it's actually worth us kind of declaring it to be false, or are we backfiring by letting more people know this false claim exists? When we do debunk, we want to avoid repetition of the falsehoods as much as possible. We want to make sure that our headlines state what is true, because there is a connection between repetition and belief. If you are in the act of debunking something and you keep saying in the story, the false claim that this, the false claim that, somebody may actually come away from that story remembering the false claim because you repeated it so many times and you didn't repeat the truth as much. So you want to lead with the positive, lead with the truth, and minimize the amount of times you talk about the false claim. You want to basically replace the false claim with the accurate information, with the true information for your audience. Okay, so that's it. It's a lot of information, but I appreciate you going through it, and I appreciate your time.